This webinar is on importing and exporting with the MMS program. We're going to be looking at how you can import data into the program and also the tools you can use to export information from MMS. So we'll start first with the import process. In the MMS program, the import function is located under the School menu, Operations, and Import Data into MMS. One of the first things you'll notice when we come into this screen is that you have quite a few choices as to which type of file you're importing from. So I'm just going to take a minute and talk about what your options are here. You can successfully import into MMS using any of these file formats. The first one that we see here is a table or a DBF file. I'm going to show you in just a few minutes that if you import from a DBF, one of the advantages is it has some of the setup work done already for you. Unfortunately, I can't open a DBF file to show you what that would look like outside of the program, but if you do have a DBF file, you can import that into MMS. Then you'll see you have options for 3 different types of delimited files, delimited with tabs, commas, or spaces. And so if I come here to some of my samples, just a sample tab delimited. If you have a file that contains information in this format with the data separated by tabs, you can certainly import that into MMS. You can also import kind of your standard comma-separated file, text file, and also a text file delimited with spaces. You can import from a CSV. I have an example here for you. Move that over a bit. And other typical files you might import from definitely include the Excel options. So actually in the 2 samples I'm going to do this morning, we'll be importing from Excel files. So when you're setting up the import, the first thing you want to consider is what type of file are you importing from, and you would make that selection here. I'm going to be doing a sample import from Excel. And underneath that, you would select where that import file is. Now, I'm going to be doing a sample import of one specific data item, AM bus numbers. And actually, I'm going to copy this file so that I can show you what's included in there while I'm setting this up in the system. This file simply includes the student's MMS ID numbers, their last name, first name, middle name, and their AM bus number. Now in MMS, after I've indicated what type of file I'm importing from, I simply select my import file here. And then towards the center of the screen, the next decision I have is I have to indicate to the system whether I'm adding completely new records or updating existing records. Now in the case of this file, I already have these students in my MMS database. I just want to update a specific piece of information for them. So in this example, I'm going to choose Update Existing Records. A little while later, I'll show you an example of adding completely new records to the system, but we'll start with a fairly simple and straightforward import. You would use the option to update existing records if you're doing something like bringing in from your lunch program the student's lunch status in terms of whether they're free or reduced lunch. If you have a file where someone has already indicated what teams your middle schoolers are going to be on, and you already have all the middle schoolers in the MMS database, but you just want to bring in this particular piece of information so that you don't have to do data entry in MMS for it, you would select the option to update existing records. So again, on this file setup screen, You simply select what type of file you're importing from. You point MMS to where your specific file is located, and you make the selection as to whether you're adding completely new records or updating information for the students who are already in the system. Then we move on to the Field Setup tab. This tab is extremely important because you're doing two things here. You're telling the system what table you're bringing the information into, and you're also matching up the items in your import file with their destination field in MMS. Now my file contains biographical information. The AM bus number is included in the biographical portion of the system. And so the table I want to bring that into is the student master table. Underneath that, I indicate how many fields are in my file. So I simply have 5. So I'll increase that to 5. And as soon as I enter 5 and then click anywhere in the gray portion of the screen, this grid will include the 5 different items I need to align. Now that I have 5 different rows in the grid, what I need to do for each item in my import file, I need to indicate what type of field that is, how long that field is, and what MMS data item it connects to. In order to complete this part of the process, you really need to know what the data item names are in MMS, what type of fields various data items are, and what the length of those fields are. And so what I'm going to do now is show you where you can get that information. So before I close out of this import area to show you where you can get the field information, I'm going to save my setting as it is. I know I need to come back and update it, but I'll save what I have so far. And we recommend that you save your import settings. You know, even if you're just importing AM bus numbers like I am, and it's a one-shot deal, if you save your settings, those settings will roll over to next year, and then if you need to import AM bus numbers next year, your settings all good to go, and you can import that pretty efficiently. So it's a good idea to save your settings just so you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you run an export. So I'll simply click on Save Settings. I'll click on Add New Record, and I'm going to enter a description for what this import is. And select Item. Now I'm going to exit out of the import area briefly so that I can show you where you can get the information about the data items and the specific information you need to set up the import. So the resource we're going to use for this data item information is under the Admin menu, and down towards the bottom, Administrative Reports and Data Fields Listing. When you open this screen, what you'll see is an alphabetical listing of all the different tables within the MMS database. Now we are bringing in student information, so I'm going to scroll down to the tables that start with the word student. And the table that holds the biographical information is the student master table. You can see that there are 2 extensions to the student master table. That's because there's so much information held in the biographical part of the system that we had to create additional tables for that. Let me start first with the student master table, and then we'll move on and take a look at what's included in the extensions. I'm going to highlight the student master table and simply click on Print. And the report that I get gives me the information I need for the import process. So you'll see that it lists the different items that are in the student master table. The description is what you'll use to kind of find the piece of information that you want. So you can see the first field, is where the student's last name is held and their ID number and first name. The column on the left gives you the MMS data item name for that piece of information. So that tells you what the abbreviation is and or the field name for that piece of data. Over to the right, this report will tell you what type of field each one is and then how long each of those fields is. So if we look at my file for the AM bus number import, I have the student's ID number, last name, first name, middle name, and AM bus number. I would come here, to see that the last name is abbreviated this way. It's 16 characters long. ID number is 16 characters, first name, middle name, and as I scroll down, I'll see the AM bus number, what the name of that field is, the type of field, and the length of that field. We generally recommend that if you're going to do an import into the system, you would want to print out the report for the data items for the table you're importing into, because it's just so handy to have this as a reference when you're setting up the import. And later on in the webinar, when we talk about how you export from MMS, these reports will be invaluable also, because when you export, you have to indicate what data you want to pull from the system, and you have to know what the name of each piece of data is. And so this data fields listing will give you that field name. So we recommend that you print out the data fields listing when you're importing or exporting. This student master table contains quite a few fields. All those pieces of information you see in the biographical area, as well as often it includes state-specific fields. So if you want to import data into one of your state fields, English language learner or special ed designation, anything like that, you would find those state-specific fields in the student master tables. So you can see here in my student master table, I have some Pennsylvania fields. Some pieces of biographical data are contained in the extensions. So if I go to extension 1 and print that, I'll see that in this case I have a different state. New Jersey items are included in the extension 1. And if I go to the student master table extension 2, I'm going to see items like team name. I had mentioned earlier that if a middle school needs to import the students' teams into MMS, the team name field is in extension 2 in this case, and so when you import, you'd want to point that piece of information to this field. It's important to realize that when you import into MMS, you can only import into one table at a time. So if my file had both the student's AM bus number and their team name, I would need to do 2 separate imports. One to bring in the AM bus number, because that's contained in the student master table, and a different import to bring in the team name, because that's contained in the student master table extension 2. By the same token, if I come back to the list of tables, you'll see that there's a separate table for the student's address and contact data, separate from the student master table. And when I print this, I can see that this is the table that contains things like parent and guardian's first names and addresses and phone numbers. So if you have a file that includes both basic student biographical information and address information, you're going to be importing into 2 different tables, and so you'd need to do 2 imports. I'm actually going to show you an example of this a little later on. I have a file that includes basic bio information and address information, so I'll give you an example of how you would take a file that has data that goes into 2 different tables and import that into the system. But basically what you want to do here in the data fields listing is print out the listing for any table that you're going to be importing into or exporting from so that you have that as a reference as you go through the rest of the process. And again, that was under Admin, Administrative Reports, and Data Fields Listing. So let's go back to the import. I can recall my settings for the AM bus number. And now that I have the printout of the student master table as a reference, I can come to the Field Setup tab and I can start aligning the fields in my file with the data items in MMS. My file includes the student's last, first, and middle name, as well as their AM bus number. And anytime you're importing student data into MMS, you want to make sure that your import file has the student's MMS ID number included. The ID number is what we're going to use as the identifying piece of information so that the system knows, who to give which bus number to. It's going to use that ID number to identify each student and to make that connection between the data in the file with the data in MMS. So the order of my items here is ID number, last name, first name, middle name, and AM bus number. You can see that the grid here just simply says field 1 through 5. So since my first one is the student's ID number, referencing the data fields listing that we just looked at, the ID number field is a character field that's 16 characters long. And in the destination field, I get a drop-down list of every data item in the student master table. And if I start typing ID, it'll bring me to that part of the list, and I can select ID number. I'll move on to my second field, which was last name. And the last name is a character field that's also 16 characters in length. And my destination field will be last name L_name. My third field is first name, which is 20 characters long. Next one is middle name, which is also 20 characters long. And AM bus number, connect that here. Okay. Now a few things before we import. Every time you import into the system, you need to designate at least one unique field. The unique field is what MMS is going to use to identify the students. So again, it can make that connection between the data in the file and the data in MMS to make sure each student gets updated correctly. With student information, the student's ID number is always a unique field. I don't need any of the other items to be a unique field because this ID number is individual and specific to each student, so the system will use that to make the connection between the data. Now, really the only piece of information that I want to update in the student records is their AM bus number. So even though my file contains the information about their names, the only thing I want MMS to update is the bus number. So what I can do actually in my setup here is, even though I have these three fields that contain the name information, unless I want the system to update the student names if there's any difference between the data in MMS and the data in the file, I can just leave these with a blank destination field. And let me show you how I do that. If I highlight field 2, which is the student's last name, and I click on the erase button over here, it simply blanks out the destination field. And I can do the same for first name and middle name. Now what this basically does is it's telling MMS when it imports, I know I have a second, third, and fourth field, but you don't need to do anything with that data. You don't need to update anything in MMS. So just recognize those fields as kind of placeholders. All I want you to do is find each student's ID number and update their AM bus number. Okay. I'm going to click on the binocular button up here above the grid because this will kind of give me a preview of the file I'm going to import, and I can use that to do a quick check to make sure I've set this up appropriately. So when I click on the binocular button, what it does is it shows me the 5 fields that I've indicated I want to import, and it's showing me the data in each one. And this is a good way to make sure that you've made the length of each field long enough so it can bring in the appropriate information. So I can see that I'm seeing the student's full MMS ID number, the full AM bus number, and so my setup looks good. One thing you'll notice is that we have a header row here with the labels of the different columns. When you're importing from an Excel file, if you have a header, the system is going to try to import that header row. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to save my setting with the updates we've made, and I'm going to exit out, and I'm going to go back into my original AM bus number, and let's take out the header row now that we've used it to use the information we needed. And let's go back to the import. Recall our settings. And now when I preview, I'll see that there's no header row, and the system will first import the information for the first student listed. At this point, I'm ready to process my import and bring the data into the system. I can do that by clicking on the process button. I prefer, however, to click on the magnifying glass button over here because that does 2 things. It processes the import and then right away will show me the results of my import. So I'm going to click on Process and Preview. When the process is complete, the preview that I get shows me basically the information in my file and then the all-important status column on the right. The status column will tell you if the information was added or updated to the system. So I can see here that the system updated the AM bus numbers, and then I find that there are some students here who were skipped. Now the reason for that in my example is that these students are in my import file, but they are not in my MMS database. I'm going to be using these students for a new student import shortly. So what the system did was, when it saw in the import file that there was a student with this ID number, it looked for that ID number in MMS and it didn't find it. And so since it didn't find that ID number, it didn't bring in that data. So this is actually correct. I don't have any of those students in my MMS database, so the system was correct in not bringing in their AM bus number. And as I continue to scroll down, I'll see that the rest of the students were updated. Let me go back to the top of my list and let's take a look at Amy here. Her bus number should be 6, so let's check her biographical record and make sure that's the case. Okay, so if I find Amy, I'll see that her bus number is indeed 6, so my data was imported correctly. So that was an example of an import where you are simply updating records for students who are already in the MMS database. Let's take a look now at an import that would involve bringing new students into the MMS database and also importing contact information. So let me show you my new student file. Now this file contains student's name, birthday, gender, grade level, and so forth. And then over to the right, it also includes contact information, contact names, addresses, email addresses, and home phone numbers. Let's use this as an example of you importing new students into your MMS database. So it's typical that schools will do this. Maybe they have an Excel file where they've collated or collected the information for all the incoming kindergartners or all the incoming new students at your school. You certainly can import those new students into MMS. You do have to make sure that you've given the student an MMS ID number and included that in the file. So sometimes schools, before they can do the import, need to take their Excel file, determine what each student's MMS ID number is going to be, add that ID number to the file. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the contact information is held in a completely different table from the student biographical information. So in this case, my import is going to be two-part. I would first bring in the basic biographical information for the students, and then once that's in place, I would bring in the contact information for the students. So let's focus on the biographical information first. I'll open my copy of this file so we can refer to this while we're setting up the import. And my biographical information is included in these columns here: ID, name, birth date, gender, grade level, homeroom teacher, and year of grad. So let's go into MMS, into the import. And I'm going to be importing from Excel. Let me pick my file. Now in this case, because these students are not in my MMS database yet, I'm going to be leaving this set to add new records, add new students to the database. I'll go on to the field setup, and I'm going to be bringing this data into the student master table. And the biographical information that I have is 10 fields. Now I know my file is longer than 10 fields, but what I'm going to do is just define the first 10 fields and just have the system disregard the rest. Okay, so bear with me 1 minute while I align the fields in my file with the ones in MMS. So my first field is the student's ID number. Again, I want that to be the unique field. That's the identifying piece of information for each student. And then I have last name, first name, middle name, then I have the student's date of birth. That's the next field. In terms of bringing in a date field, in my file, if we look at the birth date, I have slashes in between the month, the day, and the year. On the data fields listing report that you'll print from the system, date fields are listed as being 8 characters long. That does not include the slashes. So what I need to do, because my file includes the slashes, I need to indicate that this field is a date field as opposed to a character field, and I need to set it to a length of 10 so that it accounts for those slashes. If I set it to 8, it's going to cut off 2 of the digits of the date, so I need to make sure it's long enough to accommodate that. And we'll align that with the birth date field. And then we have gender and grade level. And homeroom. Homeroom teacher. And year of grad. Okay, so I've aligned the biographical items. I've indicated that the ID number is going to be the unique field. Let me click on the preview button. For the date, I want to make sure that I've set the field length long enough so that all the digits of the date are included, and that looks good. And you can see in status, because I have those additional contact fields, that I have data in my status field. I have 2 choices in terms of how to deal with this. I could go into the file and I could simply delete the columns that deal with the contact information and in essence break my file up into one file that has just the biographical information and then another one that has the contact information. So you could certainly go in and modify your file and simply clear out any columns that you're not going to import at this time. I think what I'll do is simply expand how many fields I'm going to have here. And then for all of these others after year of grad, I am simply not going to align them with a destination field. They'll just kind of be placeholders there. And if I preview now, all of these fields after field 10, because I didn't bother to indicate the field length, I'm just seeing one character, but that's fine because I'm not importing these into the system, and my status column is blank, which is what I want. So again, let me save this setting. This will be my new student bio import. And let's process and preview. Now the message I'm getting here is because I forgot to take out my header row in my Excel file. So I will simply skip this. And when I see my log file here, because I forgot to take out the header row, you can see it tried to import literally, ID number. So let me scroll over and let's take a look at the actual students I wanted to import. So it skipped that header row. No harm, no foul. And with the other students, it added their records to the system. So let's find a student. Let's do Casey Easley, and let's go to the biographical records and make sure they're in there. There's Casey. And we can see that the data I imported, gender, birthday, grade, year of grad, homeroom, and homeroom teacher, are there and intact. So again, if you're importing new students into the system, the first thing you want to do is do an import that brings in that basic biographical information. I also have contact information that I want to bring in. Because that's a different table, I need to do a separate import for that. In the case of bringing in brand new students to the database and then importing their contact information, there are a few things I need to do before I actually run that import of the contact data. The first thing I'm going to do is run a utility in MMS that's going to update the system for these new students so that MMS is ready to bring in contact information. So I'm going to go to the admin menu and data integrity. And I'm simply going to run this process that says contact table, add missing, and remove invalid records. What this is going to do is take those 12 new students who were added to the system and make sure that the database is updated so that it's ready to record contact information for them. And if I look at my log, what it's going to do is you can see for each ID number that I just imported into the system, it added contact records for me so that now the program's ready to receive the specific contact data. So if you're importing new students, after you bring in the biographical information, run data integrity to update the system for the contact information. And then before I run my second import, bringing in the contact data, I need to add something to my import file. Because MMS allows you to record more than one contact per student, some schools might record 3 contacts per student, others record up to 6 or 7 or 8 contacts per student. One of the pieces of information MMS needs is which contact are you bringing in data for? Is it contact 1? Is it contact 3? So you need to add to your import file the contact type. So what I'm going to do is right in front of the contact title column, I'm going to insert a new column, and this will be the contact type. And in my case, all of these are contact 1, which is abbreviated C1. Okay. So again, I ran data integrity to update the database to receive the contact information, and then in my import file, I had to add a column so that I could designate which contact each of these records is. And in my case, they're all contact 1, which is abbreviated C1. This time, let me delete my, oh, that's my copy. Hang on one second. Let me do that same thing in my actual file. Let me insert the column for C1. And I'm going to remove that header row and save that. Okay, so if we go back to the import setup, this will be an import from Excel. I'm going to choose that same file. Now this time, because I have the basic student biographical information in the system and I'm just bringing in contact data, I'm updating the existing records. I'll go to the field setup. This time, I'm not importing into the master table. I'm importing into the address contact table, so I need to make that designation here. And my file, now that I've added the contact type column, is up to 23 fields. Okay. The student's ID number is the first field in my file, so I'm going to designate that. And I'm going to make that a unique field. These next 9 columns where I had last name, first name, etc., I don't need to worry about importing those. So I'm going to go down to item 11, which comes after year of grad, and that's the contact type designation column that I added. So contact type in field 11 here is a 3-character field, and that's contact type, con type. Again, your printout of the student address contact data fields listing is going to be a good reference for you here. Now, because a student can have more than one contact type information brought in, I need to designate this as a unique field so that the system knows when it brings in someone's address, does that go in contact 1, 2, or 3 for the student? So contact type needs to be a unique field. While we're talking about unique fields, you know, when you're bringing in student data, the student's ID number is always a unique field. In certain tables, though, there might be other pieces of information that are unique fields also. So if you have any question about what the unique fields for an import are, you know, maybe you're importing into the student attendance records or something like that, give us a call in the support department and we can, you know, quickly tell you what fields need to be set as unique based on what table you're importing into. So, you know, feel free to use this as a resource if you have any questions about the unique field designation. Okay, so if you'll bear with me for a minute here, I'm just going to set up the different items I'm importing. So after contact type, I have the contact title. And then we have first name, contact first name. Contact last name. And then we have street number. Address 1. Address 2. City. State. Zip. And then I have a field for the contact email. Phone type. And phone number. Okay, so with those set up, let me preview. I'm not worried about fields 2 through 10 because that's the biographical data I already imported. So I'm not concerned that I don't see the full information there. I want to make sure that from field 11 on, I can see the data that's in there because that lets me know that I've set the field lengths long enough. And there's my status column. So let me save my settings here. This will be my new student contact import. And we will process and preview. And let's check our status. And we can see that they're updated. So let's check Casey Easley and make sure there's contact data there. Casey. And there's the contact information we brought in. So a few final thoughts about the import process itself. First of all, we saw in the examples I did with the imports from Excel that if there's a header row, the system's going to try and import the header row. As we saw in the example where I forgot to delete the header row, it skipped it and didn't bring it in. So it didn't cause any damage to have that in there. But keep in mind that if you are importing from Excel, you know, good process to take that header row out before you import. So you could leave it in there while you're getting things set up and aligning the fields, and then before you import, just remember to delete that. The 3 different delimited files that you can import from, you don't need to have a header there. I don't believe they have headers to begin with. Let me verify that. Yeah, so they won't have headers, so you don't need to worry about removing those. The DBF file, that will have a header, but you don't need to worry about it because the system, when it imports, knows to disregard that. CSV files, MMS will expect there to be a header row there, so you want to make sure you do have a header in your CSV file. Otherwise, what the system will do is consider the first row in that CSV as the header, and it won't import it. So if your CSV file is like mine and starts with student information, if you don't have a header row there, in this case, Robert's data won't be imported because MMS will treat that whole first row as a header row and won't try to import it. So if you are importing from a CSV, go ahead and add a header row if there isn't one already. MMS will disregard the first row and start importing the data from the second row. So the 2 main things to remember there are, in a CSV file import, make sure you have a header row. In an Excel file import, remove your header row so that your import goes smoothly. Another consideration to keep in mind that I've seen, you know, we saved settings for our 3 imports, and especially the new student imports. I've seen districts use the import process to bring in the new student information. Now, the setting that we have here is just for the school that I'm working with in MMS, my high school. So you have a couple options when you want to import data into more than one school in your district. It is possible if you have a multi-school group in MMS. You can see I've got one here called K through 12 all schools. A multi-school group is a setup you can do that would allow you to access information for all of your schools at once. You can import into one school, and if your import file includes data for students in other schools and you've indicated in your file the school code for those other students, you could do the one big import from the high school. And as long as you include the school code for the students in the file and you include the school code in the field setup, you know, and align the school code in the file with the school code in MMS, then you could, for instance, go into your high school, bring in an import file that includes students from the elementary school and the middle school. And if that school designation is there, the information will go in the correct school. The other thing you can do, because the settings we saved were just in the high school, there is a process under admin and school year maintenance where you can copy those settings to the other schools in your database. So for instance, I could use the compare and update and copy from the high school to maybe my middle school in the current year. This table called MMS User-Defined Screens, Queries, Reports, and Labels. When I compare and update with that from one school to another, What the system is going to do is look at any filters or settings I have set up in the high school, and if they're not in the middle school, it'll ask me if I want to copy them over. Now, some of them I don't want to copy over, so I'm going to skip those. What I'm looking at here is the description, because when I get to the description for my imports, I am going to add those to the middle school. It's a little tedious to click through all these, but if it saves you time in terms of setting up your import and eliminates any, mistakes you might make in setting up the import, then, you can decide if that's worth it for you. Okay, so here's my AM bus number import. I can add that to the middle school. My new student bio import I can add to the middle school, and my new student contact import. So now, if I were to move to my middle school, and go to the import process, if I go to recall settings, I see the 3 that I set up in the high school that I've copied over. So again, if you want to import into more than one school, one of your options is to set up the settings in one school, use the school year maintenance compare and update to copy those to the other schools, or as I said earlier, if your import file includes information for students in schools throughout the district, if you have their MMS school code in the file, you can import from one school, but in your field setup, if you connect the school code in the file with the school code in MMS, even if you're in the middle school, if there's a high schooler in the import file, the system will update their information in the high school according to what you have in the file. And if you have any questions at all about that, feel free again to call us in support so we can advise you how best to do that. And before we move on to how you export from the system, one last thing here in the import area. If I click on the question mark up here in the toolbar, it will bring up the help related to this process. There we go. So if you click on the question mark when you're in the import area, it'll bring up the help documentation relating to importing, and it will walk you through step by step all of the things that we've looked at today. The different types of files you can import from, how to set up the fields, etc. And so that can be a good resource for you. And again, if you have any questions about setting up the import or the process to use, give us a call in the support department and we can help you with that. So now that we've looked at importing into the system, let's talk about exporting from MMS. There are cases where you need to get data out of MMS to provide to a different program, or, for the purposes of maybe administrators in your building want certain information in Excel so they can work with it to get numbers that they need for reports they need to submit. So we're going to take a look at actually 2 different ways that you can export information from MMS. One way that you can export that is quick but a little more limited than the second method we're going to look at is most of the MMS reports, most of the standard reports in the system, you have the option to export them as a text file or an Excel file. So let me go to the Biographical menu and the Print Biographical Student Record Listing. This report, when you run it, lists as much biographical data as you want. So I currently have it set to print all of a student's biographical data, everything from homeroom and gender to the contact information. If it would be helpful to export this information, you can come to the report setup and go to Output Option, and you'll see that there's an option to save this as a text file or save it in Excel. I'm going to use Excel as an example. When you select an option like saving the report as Excel, underneath that you can change the name of the file that gets generated. And very importantly, you want to save it to a location that you can access. So a folder on your network that you can access, you want to make sure this is in a location you can get to. So I'm going to click on the ellipsis button here, and then you would just navigate to network files that you can get to and so forth. I'm going to save this in my import folder that I've been using. Okay, so I'll save this in that import file I was using. And I'll click OK and print. You'll get a message when the file has been generated. And if I go into where I saved that, here's my bio record listing. I'll open that in Excel. And this gives me a straightforward listing of all the biographical information I asked to see. And I've known schools who have run this where it does give you a lot of information, and what they'll do is simply delete the columns that they don't need for whatever their purposes are. So a quick way to export from the system would be to take one of the MMS reports and save it via the output option as a text file or an Excel file. If you do that, I'd recommend running the file and looking at it. Some of these reports translate into Excel better than others. It really depends on the nature of the report and the information that's being included. So give it a shot, see if the Excel file is something workable that you can use, and if so, great. If not, you can use the second method we're about to look at. And the other thing I wanted to mention is if you do run an MMS report, saving it to either text or Excel, go back to the output option and set it back to preview to screen, because if you don't, the next report that you go in and run, the output option will still reflect Excel or text file. So make sure that you set the output option back to preview to screen so that you aren't caught by surprise with the next report you try to run. Now the second method of exporting takes a little bit longer to set up, but it gives you additional flexibility because you have complete control over what information you're exporting. And the main tool we use for exporting is the Precision Report Writer. That's located under the School menu, School Management Reports, and we're going to go into Precision Report Writer Designer mode because that allows us to create these exports as well as run them. Every time you come into the Precision Report Writer, you'll get this message. It explains what we in support can do for you when you call in. If you're creating a report, a printed report, we're more limited as to how we can help you. But if you're exporting, which is pretty much simply indicating what information you want to pull from the system, you can give us a call if you run into issues as you export. So I'll click OK here. This next screen lets me control what school year or years I want to include. I'm just interested in the current one, so I'll say OK. And when you come into the Precision Report Writer, what it's doing actually is getting a copy of the latest and greatest data for you to work with. So we'll set up some exports here, and then every time you come into the Report Writer to run them, the information it shows you is the most recent data. Now, the example I'm going to use for my export today is one that includes some basic student biographical information as well as contact data. So I'm going to click on New to create a new export file. Oops, hang on one second. Okay, so I'm going to click on New to create a new export file. Now, when you create a file, a new request in PRW, in the lower left-hand corner, you have a choice of 4 different types of files or types of requests to create. The first 3, Detail, Summary, and Crosstab, do allow you to export into a different file format. The label does not. Now, typically, when you're exporting using PRW, you export a detail request, but do know that you can also export summary and crosstab. My particular example is going to be a detail request. So I'll select detail and click OK. And in my request editor, which is where I set up my export, I simply first need to give this a name and a description. So be really creative here and call this export. And then my next step is to identify which data items I need to export from the system. This is the step where the printout of the data fields listings is so helpful because you know what information you want to pull, but here in the setup, you need to know what the data items are called in MMS. And so referencing those reports will be helpful. So I'm going to go to Data Items. And in the data item area, I have an alphabetical listing of every single data item in the database. So it's a pretty extensive list. My sample export here is simply going to include, student first and last name, and we'll do maybe grade level, homeroom, and address and phone number. So in my example, I'm going to be exporting to Excel, and so for the student names, I want those separate items, last name, first name. So I'm going to click in my list of data items, and referencing my data fields listing, I know that the field for student last name is L_name. So I'm going to type in L. It'll bring me to that part of the list, and I'll just scroll down until I find L_name. Now you'll see that there are 2 entries for L_name, and the difference is the table abbreviation that's in the middle column. We know from our import process that EMF is the student master table, but a resource for you here is when you have an item highlighted, you can come up to this description in the top of the box, and it tells you what table the information's coming from and the data included in this item. So I can see that this item is coming from the student master table, and it's the student last name. If I clicked on the other last name, it would tell me that this data is coming from the mail merge tracking table. Well, I don't want that. I just want everyone's last name from the biographical system. So I'd highlight last name from the EMF and double click on that to move it over to my selected items. I also want first name, and I'll do grade level, and homeroom. And let's pull some contact information as well. So let's say I want the student's street number, address, city, state, and zip. So I'm going to find the field for contact street number. And you can see that it's listed here multiple times. And the difference again is what table the item's coming from. The con table, C-O-N, if you pick any items from the con table, you'll get a record for every different contact that you maintain in MMS. Whereas if you pick an item from contact C1, C2, C3, etc., you would get just the information for that specific contact. So let me show you an example. I'm going to select the street number from the general contact table, and I'm going to click OK, and I'm actually going to preview this. And you'll see for each one of my students, they are listed multiple times. I have my MMS database set to record 6 contacts per student, and because I selected the street number from the general contact table, each student is listed 6 times, once for each type of contact. If instead I'm going to double click on the street number from the general contact table. I'm going to double click there to move it back. And instead I'm going to choose street number from the con_C1, the contact 1 table. If I click OK and preview that, now you'll notice that each student is listed once. So the thing to remember, if you're in the Precision Report Writer and you want to export contact information, unless you want the contact information for every contact per student, select the contact fields from the specific contact type you're interested in. In my experience, many times that's contact 1. So what I'm going to do as I pick my other contact fields is I'm going to make sure I select all of them from con_C1. So contact address, and we'll do city, state, and zip. Okay. Now, in my case, I have selected items from 2 different tables, the EMF table and the contact C1 table. Because I've selected information from 2 or more tables, when I run the export, the system is going to pay attention to which filter I have running in MMS. So when I run this, it's going to give me all of my active students. If you set up this export and you want to run it just for your seniors and you have a filter for seniors, you could change your filter to your senior filter, come in and run the export, and it would just include the students in that filter. Now I also have options to sort the information in whatever way I choose. If I click on the sort button, if I double click on last name and then first name, it will give me the students in order alphabetically. If I moved grade level over and moved that to the top, it would give me the students in order by grade level. So when you're exporting, you know, it's your call if you want to do that sorting here in the setup or sort the students once they're in Excel. You can also set up a filter where you could, you know, for instance, say I just want a certain grade level or homeroom. So you have filtering options here as well. Now before I send this information to Excel, I always preview it kind of as a report to make sure that I have the information I intend. So I'm going to click on Preview. And because I've included so much information, the system is asking me, do you want to run it as is or fit it to page? And in my case, I want to fit it to the page. It's going to use a smaller font so that I can see all the information across the page. And my goal here is simply to make sure that I picked the right data items and that I'm seeing the information I expect. So what I always do when I'm generating an export from PRW is I do my setup and I preview it and I look at that report preview to make sure I have the information I want in the order I want it. And the last step is is the step that I use to export it to whatever file I would like. To export, you would click on the Output button here towards the lower left. And this drop down here for output type shows me the different ways I can output the data. Now in this case, I'm not interested in a printed report. I want to export the data so I can work with it. So options that are available to you here, you can, if the data is appropriate, you could choose to export it as a graph, in which case in the second drop down you would want to select which type of graph you would want. I'm actually going to talk about spreadsheet last. I just want you to be aware of the other options you have here. If you select the option to output the information as a mail merge, over here to the right, I'll leave it set as to Microsoft Word. And then I'm going to click on the Word file. I'm going to save this in my import folder, and I'm going to click on Run. I'm going to go through this process again when we export to Excel, but I just wanted to show you what you get when you export for the mail merge. And here's my export file, and basically what it does is it kind of gives you a file you could use in conjunction with a Microsoft Word mail merge, and these are the fields you'd be able to pull in. Also under Output, I have the ability to output to an ASCII file. When I do that, I can choose either a fixed length file or a delimited file. Fixed length, and again, I'll go through this process in just a minute. A fixed length file, we'll give you a text file separated that way. And you could also choose to output to an ASCII file that is delimited. Now, the file saves with an extension, in this case of ASC. What I usually do is I open it in Notepad. Okay, and you'll see a quotation, comma separated file. I open it in Notepad, and then I simply rename it with a TXT extension. So I've got my text file there. And you can also save to a data output type that creates a DBF file. Again, I won't be able to open that for you, but if it would be helpful in your situation to export the data into a DBF, you have that option here. So let me go back to exporting as a spreadsheet, and what I'm going to do is take a little more time to explain some of these steps I've been using to generate the other files. So I'm going to choose spreadsheet, and to the right of that in my options, I'm going to select to simply create the Excel file. I don't want to launch it. So I'm going to choose Excel file only, and then this next step is really important because I need to make sure I select a location to save the Excel file that I will be able to access. And to do that, I'm going to click literally on the Word file down here, and it brings up a Save As screen. Now by default, the report writer wants to save any of these exports in this Out folder, which is buried deep within your MMS Generations folder. What you want to do is select a location that you can access. So again, that might be a network drive that you'd see here. In my case, I'm going to go into that import folder that I've been using. So select a location that you can access, and then for the file name down here, you can keep the name you gave the request setup, or you can change the name. And then you have to make sure that you click on the Run button here in the lower left-hand corner. That will actually generate the file. So all we've done up to this point is set up the file, the information we want in the file. Clicking Run actually generates it. Now when you click on Run, in my case, my screen's just going to flash briefly. In your case, depending on the size of the file and where you're saving it, you might see a message box up here in the upper right that indicates that it's processing the file. And when that message box goes away, then you know the file's complete. So if I go back to my import folder, here's my export test, and if I open that, here are the student names, grade levels and homerooms, and then the contact information I asked for. So again, when you export from Precision Report Writer, do your setup, and then you go to the Output button. You select Spreadsheet, Excel file only. Literally click on the Word file so that you can select where you want to save this and change the name if necessary. And then to actually generate the file, you'll click on Run. Once you've done that initial setup, in the future, when you come into PRW, if you just want to run the request as is, you could find that particular request in the list and simply double click on it. You'll get the message that it's processing, and then if I go back, I'll see that this file's updated as I just ran it. So again, you can import data into the system using the function in MMS. You can export data from the system, either taking a standard MMS report and choosing to output it to text or Excel. And you can also use the Precision Report Writer to export to a number of different file formats. And if you're using any of these features and come across any questions, feel free to give us a call in the support department so we can assist you.